What's going on, everybody? This is Ben with liftedimports.com, and today I wanted to talk to you about some of the most common ways that you will see people lifting Subarus and some of the methods that you can use to get extra ground clearance. And one of the first things to determine is, what's really the purpose of why you're wanting to lift the car. If you are just lifting it for aesthetic purposes, which, by the way, I have zero problem with that. If you just like the way that a lifted car looks, I can't fault you for that at all. I think they look great too. I definitely off-road my cars, but if you don't, you still want to lift it, I absolutely think you should. Okay, so right out of the gate, the first and easiest, most basic way to get a little bit more ground clearance in a Subaru is to just install a slightly larger tire. Now, when I'm talking about installing a larger tire, I'm not talking about like, oh, let's go ahead and put like 35s on this thing. I'm talking maybe an inch in overall diameter difference. So if your car came with, let's say, a 27.5-inch top to bottom tire, like overall diameter, if you wanted to put something that was maybe an inch taller, that would give you a 1/2 inch of overall ground clearance once it's installed on the car. Now, you got to be careful when you're doing that without a lift kit. You just got to make sure that you take all your measurements, do your research, make sure that it's going to fit on the car the way that it is. And I definitely think that if you're going to go off-road, installing a bigger tire is 100% one of the best things that you can do. It will give you more grip. It's going to give you more resistance to punctures. It's going to have a stronger just carcass and stronger sidewall, which means you can air it down more aggressively, not worry about pinching the sidewalls and blowing them out. And just, I don't know, I think they look cool too. So there's nothing wrong with that either. So regardless of what you do to lift your Subaru, at some point, bigger tires are probably going to become part of the equation one way or the other. Whether you do a lift kit, whether you don't lift the car and just do bigger tires, off-road tires are probably gonna at some point be installed on your Subaru if you have any desire to take it off-road. Okay, so let's jump into some of the ways to install lift kits, the different types of lift kits that are out there. Number one is a lift kit that is comprised of strut top spacers. Now, a strut spacer basically looks like this. You can get spacers that look all different ways. These are the spacers that I run. They're from Anderson Design and Fabrication. There's a lot of other options out there. I personally would never cheap out on my spacers because you install them once and then you don't have to worry about it. So I think getting something that's quality the first time is definitely the best practice because there's some cheap kits out there that are not built correctly. But basically, a strut top spacer, what it does, you've got your strut set up, so you'll have your strut and your spring. This will just bolt to the top of your struts and give you, in this case, 2 inches of lift. So this goes up against the body, the unibody of your Subaru, gives you that extra ground clearance. Now, the reason that I lift my vehicles this way, using this method, is it's super reliable. It's very affordable. The most easy way to retain the OEM suspension of your Subaru. So if you run these, you can still retain the reliability and the comfort of the OEM suspension. In my opinion, the OEM suspension is probably the most comfortable, probably the most reliable suspension that's out there. And you already have it. It's already on your car. And the other thing that I really like, if you bend a strut, blow a strut out, if you have some sort of problem with your factory suspension, it's pretty easy to replace it. So if you've got these installed and you're running factory struts and you bend a strut, all you got to do is go on Amazon Prime and get one overnighted to your house, or go maybe even be able to find a good high quality KYB replacement unit at AutoZone or O'Reilly's. And I just think it's it's convenient. You know, your car is not going to be up on jack stands for weeks at a time waiting for an aftermarket strut assembly to show up and be ready to go. In general, this is what I think 80 to 90% of people are probably going to be just fine running a strut spacer. There's nothing wrong with them. Contrary to popular belief, I don't know why this is a thing right now, but they do not damage your CV axles if they're purchased from a reputable company that only provides lift within certain parameters. These will not just magically destroy your Subaru CV axles. Okay, so that's the first most basic common way that people have been lifting Subarus for over a decade. The next thing that you can do is you can use lift springs. So a lift spring you'll typically get anywhere from, I'm not sure the numbers right off the top of my head, but I would say between a 1/4 inch and an inch is what you can typically get out of a spring lift. I think that has to do with just the limitations that the struts themselves have as far as, how far they can travel. I'm probably totally wrong on that, but this is a King spring that I purchased through Primitive Racing. King springs, if you're going to do a spring lift, are probably my favorite aftermarket spring. They hold up really well. They're made with substantially higher quality control than anybody else that I've seen in their price range. The coating, I've never seen people have these just rust out in a couple of years like I've seen with other springs. So this, in my opinion, is probably the best spring lift that you could get if you're just going to do a spring lift. Now, the benefit of doing a spring lift, there's a couple things. Number one, you get a little bit of lift. Number two, you can buy them at a different spring rate. So let's say you want something a little bit stiffer because you've got a heavy winch bumper in the front, and you've got a really heavy rear tire carrier where you've got a full-size spare on the rear and you carry a bunch of camping equipment on a regular basis. Heavier spring rates are basically going to help offset any of the sagging that may occur when you're loaded down like that. Now, let's say you want to combine a spring lift and a strut spacer lift. You can absolutely do that. On a lot of Subarus, as long as you don't exceed 2 inches of overall lift, you can be totally fine. So a lot of people, for example, Primitive Racing, they provide lift kits that incorporate the King springs with some HDPE spacers, and you can basically get your full 1.5 to 2 inches of lift and get a slightly stiffer spring rate, and then you're good to go. You can load up with camping gear, load up with kayaks, hiking, all the kind of stuff that you could ever be into without it just sagging the suspension down. Now, the only downside, in my opinion, with stiffer springs like this is that when you're on the trails, in most situations, aftermarket springs are just going to be a lot more harsh when you're not on pavement. So just consider that. If you're going to be out on the trails driving all day, it's going to be a lot more bumpy. You're going to want to air down if you're out on the trails. Now, when you're on the street, the good thing about a lift like this with, overload springs, the car is going to handle a little bit better on the road. So even though you're lifted, a stiffer spring rate is going to help offset that body roll that you might experience from the higher center of gravity of having a lift kit. So a lot of people like that. If you're only going to be off the pavement maybe 15, 20, 30% of the time, probably you're not going to be having any issues and not super frustrated. But if your Subaru is almost exclusively driven off the pavement, you might want to think, whether or not you would want something that's that stiff. And if you're not sure, honestly, if you've got questions about what you think would be the best ride quality for you, if you call Primitive Racing and say, hey, I got some questions. I'm having a little bit of a hard time deciding what would be right for me. Blake over there, he's a solid dude, and he is a legitimate stage rally driver. Check them out. Give them a call if you got questions. The next and final and increasingly popular way to lift a Subaru is with aftermarket suspension assemblies. So completely replacing not just the springs of your OEM setup, but literally pulling the entire suspension of your Subaru out. and replacing it with aftermarket options. Now, a lot of people are running things like Ironman, and I think Rough Country now offers a suspension lift. In a Subaru, in my opinion, you're not really gaining anything by doing completely new suspension components. That's my opinion. You don't really gain any extra travel, because with a Subaru, you're limited on your travel anyways by the CV axles and by the control arms. So even if you've got something that technically has more suspension travel, you really are already limited unless you do a lot of extensive modifications that cost tons of money that are really not going to make your car that much more capable. Your suspension travel is going to be the same even if you have a real suspension lift. The whole suspension lift thing on things like Jeeps or anything with solid axles or, real 4x4s, a suspension lift makes a little bit more sense on setups like that. On Subarus, you really don't gain anything. And I'm always hesitant when it comes to things that I'm going to have to replace at some point, because you will have to replace them at some point. They will bend, they will break, there's going to be a situation where they wear out. That's part of the game. It is what it is. Doesn't matter how good a quality you purchase, they will need replacing at some point. What I don't want to have happen is if I've only got one vehicle and it's my daily driver and I blow out a strut, I don't want to have to call the company and say, hey, I need this right now. They're going to be like, oh yeah, we can get you a replacement, but we'll send it out today. It'll be there in like a week and a half. So you're like, okay, cool. So now I don't have a car for a week and a half where I got to drive on this clapped out strut that's probably not safe. So that's my biggest concern with things like that. I don't necessarily see the purpose in it. Now, where I do appreciate aftermarket strut assemblies that are taller than stock is if your OEM suspension is already hammered and already on the way out, then it makes sense, because it's like, okay, this is already assembled. I'm not going to have to use a spring compressor to install the springs on my old suspension components. I can literally just unbolt the old stuff, put the new stuff in, and I'm good to go. That is absolutely something to consider. And it does make the install process a lot more convenient, because with just doing a spring lift, like I was talking about earlier, that kind of lift, you do have to either rent a spring compressor, buy a spring compressor, or take them to a shop. That's, it's not a big deal, but it does take a little bit more time. So if you buy something like the Ironman 4x4 or those Rough Country pre-assembled lift struts, you can just install them and go. But again, I don't necessarily know where they're made. I have no idea where they're made at. I don't know how easy I could get a replacement if I had a problem. So that's my biggest, apprehension with things like that. You may also see long travel coilovers. Now, long travel coilovers I think are great. However, with a Subaru, like I mentioned a second ago, you're limited by the control arms and the CV axles in the front and the rear. So it doesn't matter how much travel your coilovers actually have and are capable of. On a Subaru, you really can't utilize that. However, a long travel coilover, in my opinion, is a great option if you want to be able to dial in your suspension, if you want to be able to change the dampening, if you want to order something that's got a very specific spring rate. Most coilover manufacturers will do that for you. That stuff, I'm not a suspension person when it comes to like, oh, I got to make sure that I calibrate my suspension for my body weight and all that stuff. I think it's cool that people know how to do that, but I just don't care. It's not practical for what I do in my cars. I just like to get in them, take them out in the forest and bang them into trees and rocks and have fun. But for some people, that may be something that you need. Again, if you're somebody that's got a bunch of gear in the car and you want to be able to, let's say, before a camping trip, you actually want to change the height of your coilovers, you can absolutely bring the rear up or down or whatever you want to do and then lock it in. Coilovers are awesome because you can adjust the height, which can be a blessing and a curse. With most other lift kits, you install it and you go. With coilovers, you got to set them up first. You got to set the right height, then you got to dial the height in after they're installed to make sure everything's good. You also got to make sure that the preload is set properly before you install it. And if it's not something that you're familiar with and something that you don't know a lot about, it can just become a headache, because then you're going to have to take it somewhere to somebody that actually knows what they're doing. They can set it up for you and get it dialed in properly. The other nice thing with long travel coilovers is in older Subarus that had McPherson style struts in the rear, like first gen Foresters, second gen Foresters, first gen Imprezas up to like 08, I think. Just a lot of the older Subaru stuff, they had McPherson style struts in the rear, which had a large spring perch, which would limit the size of the wheel and tire that you could run, because the tire would rub on the spring perch. With a long travel coilover, you can just put those in and they're real skinny. They don't have a spring perch that sticks out, so they don't restrict your tire at all. So that's one huge benefit of them for those of you driving older vehicles. You don't have to worry about that. In my opinion, that's not really a huge issue even with those cars, because you can always run a slightly lower offset wheel. Like the Method MR502s fit just fine. Even with a 235/75 R15, I've run those with the spring perches still there and run it on a +15 offset wheel. No problem, no rubbing, no nothing. Now, the downside that you'll want to consider when it comes to coilover lifts, they do require some maintenance. So you got to make sure that the threads don't get seized up. So you're going to have to make sure that you apply anti-seize to them, because if the rings lock up, you're going to have a hard time getting them unstuck and adjusting the height, and they'll just be stuck at whatever height they're at. Then if you live somewhere where it's salty, you're going to once a year pull your wheels off, check, make sure the threads are all good, and you might have to get in there with a wire brush and clean stuff off and hit them with some sort of a rust prevention coating or something. You can't just throw coilovers on and expect them to just last forever. They are going to require some maintenance. The other thing is, in a lot of cases, the manufacturers recommend getting them rebuilt on a certain interval, which means you're going to have to pull your coilovers off, put them in a box, send them off to the manufacturer, and have them rebuilt. Again, if it's your daily driver, do you really want to do that? You're going to have to get your alignment redone. You're going to have to do a lot of these different things, which you should be getting alignments regularly anyways. This is just stuff that I never thought about, because initially I was like, oh, long travel coilovers, yes, now I can actually be a rock crawler. Wrong. It's not like that. Anyways, this is not supposed to be a comprehensive overview of all the different styles of lift kits and things like that. I just wanted to give you guys just a quick idea what some of the options are, give you an idea of what some of the benefits are. I don't think you're going to make a bad decision going any direction here. If you run a spacer kit, absolutely no problem. They're reliable. They will last forever. If you get a good one, you'll be good to go for, honestly, probably over a decade, maybe longer. You get a spring lift, nothing wrong with that either. You'll just have to have a slightly longer install process, and you may or may not like the final outcome of the way that the car handles. You'll just have to see if you like it, and if not, you can move on to something else. And then with the aftermarket suspension assemblies, they're great if your struts are already kind of worn out, you need something new. But other than that, I don't really, in most cases, see the need to jump to an aftermarket suspension assembly over a strut spacer lift kit. That's just my opinion. I don't think, again, that you can make a bad decision here at all. But I hope this is helpful for kind of giving you an idea of what some of this stuff looks like, what it is. If it's helpful for you, hit the subscribe button, hit a like, leave a comment, and let me know what kind of Subaru you're driving. Let me know what kind of plans you have for that Subaru, and I'd love to see it. But until next time, I'll see you guys out on the trail. I hope you have a fantastic day.